Thank you. They took my computer away, so hopefully I've memorized my notes well enough to give the presentation. But going off of what we just heard from Social Security, I think the theme that I have today is that we have to think outside of the box. And the box has traditionally been that we have a defined benefit plan and that we are going to receive benefits that were promised to us when we go to retire. And unfortunately, if we continue to think that way, what we're finding is through negotiations, we're losing some of those benefits. So we have to think a little bit differently, because the things that we used to have available to us, historically speaking, when we went to retire, used to be a pension, used to be Social Security benefits, and then we also had the third leg, which was savings. I saw that he asked how many of us had access to Social Security. A number of you raised your hands saying that you don't. So we've already cut off one of the legs of the stool. And now we're finding that our defined benefit programs are shortening. So either we're going into negotiations and we're negotiating packages that are affecting our new members coming on board, or perhaps they're reducing the benefits that we have moving forward. So let's talk a little bit about all of the kind of challenges we have, and then ultimately some of the solutions that we're bringing to the table. So this is what our pension plans look like as a whole across the state of Connecticut. And many of you may recognize this slide from last year. The issue is that the majority of our pension plans are significantly underfunded, which ultimately means that at some time in the future, that red line, which is the assets, and that blue line at the bottom will ultimately come to a collision point, and the benefits will continue to be needed to be paid, but the assets won't be available to do that. And this is what we're seeing. And the reason being that we're seeing this is, one, because the liabilities and the assets have never matched up properly. Two, because some of our municipalities don't have the ability to put the full contributions in. And three, we've had returns that have ultimately devastated some of our assets. And ultimately what we're finding is that our benefits are going to outlive our assets. And this is why so many of them are looking to negotiate that benefit away. They think that if they stop the bleeding today, that ultimately this goes away. It doesn't, because this benefit is going to last until the last surviving member is dead, which means that if they stop it today, these don't go away, they continue. So what's happening is, even if you're maintaining your defined benefit plan, there could be a possibility at some time in the future that they won't be able to pay that benefit. So what are they going to rely on? They're going to rely on the state. Can the state pick up the pieces? That's a good question. Social Security I won't touch on because you've already heard on that. So what it ultimately comes down to is that one-legged stool now, which is the savings, comes down to you assuming the risk. And that's a little scary because the risks are great. One, we have to know how much we need to accumulate in order to supply us with an income for the rest of our lives. And remember, many of you may retire in your 40s and early 50s and then go into a second career and then retire again. But this money that we've put away needs to provide us for perhaps 30 or 40 years after retirement. And do we know how much we need to save? Longevity risk. Do you know the fastest growing segment of the population is people over 100? Now, I will tell you, most of you will tell me that you're not going to live to be 100. Pete said that at retirement parties he's going to start giving out packs of cigarettes, so you guys are assured that you won't live to 100. But the reality is you don't know when you're going to die. My mom says she's going to die with a dime in her pocket so that she doesn't leave any of her kids with money. The reality is we just don't know when we're going to live, and we're living well into our 80s. Participant user risk. How many of us have been following the market lately? Little scary, little volatility in the market. So are you equipped to make the right decisions at the right time, or are you making the wrong decisions at the wrong time, because that's going to affect your outcome? Inflation, we haven't seen it rear its ugly head in a while, but most retirees will tell you that inflation is very different in retirement. 7% annual increase in health benefits. That's what they're paying. That's a 7%. So how many of us have kids in college right now? Okay, you know it's going up at about 7% a year. Health benefits when you retire, that's about what it's going up. So you have to earmark 7% of your retirement benefits just for health. And then transition risk. This is something that not a lot of people are talking about. But if I retired today with $100,000 in a very low interest rate environment, my income stream from that $100,000 is going to be very different than had I retired with $100,000 and interest rates were at 8%. And this is a risk that all of us are going to bear moving forward. I would tell you that this is an easy thing to accomplish. Accumulation is the easy part, to be honest with you. Because if we don't accumulate enough and we're not prepared for retirement, we can continue to work. We can contribute more into our retirement programs. But the day that we decide to retire, so this slide says accumulation stage is the end of the beginning. Distribution stage must last until the end. So now this distribution has to last us for the rest of our lives. So what are we trying to do with the programs that I'm going to talk about today? Because many of us are finding that our defined benefit plans are changing, there's a recognition that we have a base, and that's our needs. We need to be able to put a roof over our head. We need to be able to feed our family. We need to be able to put clothes on, heat. Some of us may think differently, but we have a base that we need to cover. And that's what the defined benefit plan was meant to do. So how are we going to continue to protect that benefit moving forward so that we can at least provide just the basics? Obviously, the wants, maybe a fishing trip every other month or so, is something that's additional, but what we want to cover in this presentation today is really the needs. So with that, now we've moved away from kind of trying to protect our defined benefit plans and I want to make this very clear. Our first priority is to protect those defined benefit plans. When I go into negotiations, we fight tooth and nail, and Lou can attest to this, to maintain those defined benefit plans. But if we're forced into a defined contribution situation, our next mission is to protect the savings. We need to protect those savings. We need them to grow. We need proper contributions into those programs. And that's what we are solving for today. More importantly, I said the accumulation phase was easy. We then need to look at what happens when you go to retire. Remember, I said to you, we're looking to solve for that needs, which is what our defined benefit program used to do. So the programs that we're talking about today also take into account when you retire. How do you deploy those assets in retirement? Because the risks are very different. The order of return you receive, if it's not correct, you ultimately could outlive your money. Withdrawal returns, longevity risk, participant user risk, inflation risk, health risk, spending risk. These are all risks that we need to address on the next phase of it, which is from accumulation to decumulation. So let's talk a little bit about withdrawal risk. Withdrawal risk is definitely tied to longevity. These kind of coincide with one another. You know, it was interesting, when you talk to retirees and you say, how much money have you saved for your retirement? Many of them will say, hey, we ran these programs and we have enough money to last us for the rest of our life. We say, that's interesting. So let's say that I'm 65 and I have $100,000, and I assume that I should withdraw 5% on an annual basis. Let's not take into account inflation. And if I take 5%, which is $5,000 a year, at age 65, and I die 10 years later, no problem. I die with $50,000 left. I've lived the life that I planned on. However, if I live well into my 90s, guess what? At a withdrawal rate of 5%, I've actually outlived my money. It died at age 85. So how much do you think is a reasonable rate to withdraw from your retirement program at retirement? Any guesses? Good guess. So 10% was the first amount. Let's address that. MetLife did a survey of retirees, and 43% of them thought that they should be withdrawing 10% of their nest egg at retirement. That is not the correct answer. 7% is also not the correct answer. 2% guarantees you no flaws, and the Wall Street Journal did a huge study on this, and 2% is the absolute maximum they believe that you should withdraw in order to be safe. However, for planning purposes, most of us use a 4%, and there's a 20 to 30% failure rate with that. So understanding how to withdraw your money at retirement is important, and again, it's going to be tied to your longevity. Let's talk a little bit about returns. Of course, when we're accumulating, what are we focused on? What's our rate of return? But when we go to retire, it's not what's our rate of return, it's the sequence that our rate of return comes in. So let's look at this example. We had a $100,000 investment. Year one, we were up 7%. We were up 27% the following year. And the last year, we were actually down 13%. On average, we still had an average rate of return over the past 3 years of 7%. What if the reverse happened? Year one, we were up 7%, then we were down 13%, then we were up 27%. What do you think the average rate of return would have been? More or less? It's exactly the same. It's 7%. Your average rate of return is 7%. When you go to retire, this matters. The sequence matters. Here's why. Mr. Smith and Miss Jones both retired on the same day with the same amount of money. Miss Smith, or Mr. Smith, had an average rate of return over his lifetime of 10.5%, and he ran out of money at age 85. Miss Jones had a lower rate of return of only 9.6% and still had money at age 94. Why? Because Mr. Smith in the beginning had some negative rates of return and then had positive rates of return. Miss Jones actually had positive rates of return in the beginning and then negative rates of return at the end. The sequence of your rate of return is going to determine how long your money is going to last. And these are things that we have to solve for when we move into a defined contribution plan. We have to address these issues. I know that many of you don't think that you're going to live to be 100, but if you're married, guess what? You have a higher probability of living longer. Actually, right now, 50% of married people, one individual, will live to be over age 90. It's kind of scary when you start to think of it. You're going to live a lot longer than you anticipate. If you talk to any of your grandparents or older people, they would tell you, I never thought I would live to see this day. We have to address that. That's a concern. Why is that a concern? Because longevity risk is something we can't control. We don't know when we're going to die. And more importantly, it's a multiplier. By that I mean, if I retired at age 65 and the markets went down and I withdrew 20% and I died at age 68, doesn't matter. I lived 3 years, doesn't matter. If, however, I did the same thing and I lived till age 94, all of those things have a very serious consequence to my outcome. So longevity risk is something that I think we have to solve for in our plans moving forward with any of these defined contribution plans. So what are we doing today? Well, again, the first thing that we're doing during negotiations is fighting tooth and nail to maintain our defined benefit plans. And the reality is that we may have a very valid case with solid numbers, and the reality is that they think that defined benefit plans are too expensive and that the voters want a defined contribution plan. And unfortunately, what's happening is in some cases, we're losing the battle. So when that happens, we need to think outside of that box. We need to think differently. So what we've actually put together is your own 401A plan. That if you're in negotiations and they say, we're moving to defined contribution plan, come hell or high water, at least you can say, well, I'm going to move to a defined contribution plan that has taken all of my risks as a member into account. Not the rest of the municipality, but my risks into account. And now we start to focus on negotiating the contribution. We know that we need X percentage of money put into the program in order to supply you guys with X amount of dollars. And if you don't have Social Security, then they better put more in. Also, the 457 plans. You now have available a 457 plan that's controlled by the union. This means, again, that they've looked at all the risks, the accumulation and the decumulation risk, and they've built a program that is better for you. That's built based upon what we know about you, not anybody else. So moving forward, when we started this project, it was to come up with a better defined benefit plan. And unfortunately, the reality is the second we said defined benefit plan during negotiations, we had a lot of them shut down. We then realized quickly that this has nothing to do with defined benefit or defined contributions. This has to do with getting you a base sum of money to provide you with an income at retirement, to supply you with those needs that you needed. And we looked at the impact of the fees, we looked at plan design, we looked at how to get the municipalities to contribute what we need in order to supply you with that benefit, the impact of the types of investment options that you have available to you, how you're being educated, how you're being communicated to. So all of these have been taken into a consideration. I'll leave you with this, because I'm sure that I'm the speaker between you and happy hour. If you remember nothing, please remember this slide. If I were to walk into a burning building, I am sure that my choices would not be well thought out because I haven't been trained properly. I don't know how fire reacts. Similar to this, here's a car, a Volkswagen. It's been taken apart meticulously, piece by piece. Now, most of us sitting in this room could put together a car that looks like a car. We might know how to put on doors, or we might know how to put the steering wheel in. We might even know how to build the engine. That car may not turn on, it may not go anywhere. When you go into negotiations, if you don't know where every single piece fits during negotiations for your health, your salaries, and your retirement benefits, you could have a car that looks perfect, but nobody can turn it on, and it certainly isn't going to go anywhere. So what I would encourage you to do when you get into a situation is to make sure that you involve Lou so that he can say, hey guys, we got to bring some experts in. There's a lot of pieces here. We got to figure out how they're going to impact the ability for this car to go from point A to point B. Any questions or concerns or anything that I can answer? I know this is riveting information. It's very important, though. Beer's getting warm, I guess. Well, I'm always available to you guys. Lou and Pete have my contact information. I know a couple of you have reached out to me. You can always pick my brain. I'm happy to bounce ideas off of you, give you pointers when you walk into negotiations, give you data, give you statistics, whatever we can help with. But what I want to make sure that you're aware of is that you have the ability, when you walk into negotiations and kind of get put up against the wall on your defined benefit plan, to say, hey, if we move to a defined contribution plan, and whether it's for you or your new members, there's a better product, a better plan for you out there that we've designed specific for you as members that's going to address what we're trying to protect, with it, which is the defined benefit plan. and protect those savings so that you do have that retirement income when you do retire. Appreciate your time if there's no questions.
Thank you.